budgets. We know it's a really busy time and we really appreciate you taking the time to participate today. I'm Erica McKellar and I'm with the Fiscal Affairs Program here at NCSL. And I'm also the liaison to the National Association of Legislative Fiscal Offices, or NALFO, which is one of NCSL's professional staff associations and the group sponsoring this webinar today. Before we begin, I invite you to just type your name, state, and office in the chat box, just so we can get a feel of who's online and get to know each other just a little bit. And I also want to note that this Zoom call is being recorded and will be available on our website, as well as Dan's slides after the presentation. Myself and my colleague, Emily Mayer, will be monitoring the chat box today for our speaker. So please feel free to put any questions you might have in there, or feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions. We'd love for this to be interactive, so please don't be shy. And please also feel free to just share information about what's happening in your state. That's always good for us to hear as well. Lastly, if you have any technical difficulties, please message me or Emily directly, and we'll put our emails in the chat box so you have those available. So as we all know, K-12 education is one of the largest and most important part of state budgets, and the COVID-19 pandemic is creating challenges for those budgets in new and different ways, from remote learning and classroom safety to student counts and funding formulas. So today, our speaker is Dan Thatcher, NCSL's Senior Fellow in our Education Program. Dan has tracked education finance policy for over 13 years and has co-founded NCSL's Education Finance Fellowship in partnership with the Learning Policy Institute to support the expertise of state legislators and legislative staff in this critical policy area. With that, I will turn the program over to Dan. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Erica, and thank you so much for inviting me to share what a little bit of the information and trends that we've been following since the pandemic started raging our country. So I come to you from about 8,700 feet in Winter Park, Colorado. It's a chilly, probably about 10 degrees out right now. It was 2 degrees when I woke up, but the internet still works at that temperature and at this elevation, fortunately. I'm gonna go ahead and open up share my presentation. As I do, I really do hope that you interrupt me where you feel you need to ask a question or to have a clarification or to opine what's happening on your states, anything like that. So I'm just looking at making sure I got all the, let's see, looking at my windows and the right one to share. I love that this is so easy. Let me try this. And then, let's see. Sorry about this. It's always a challenge. Here we go. Okay, I think we're good now. So when talking about education finance, either as I'm traveling around the country and speaking with other organizations that don't really understand the state legislative role in education finance, I've come up with a kind of a framework for talking about it. So I'm going to introduce this now and use this framework to discuss kind of some of the different entree points for policy in this issue area. So when I do, I like to talk about it like it is a blueprint that the legislature creates. The funding for K-12 education is a statutory and state constitutional requirement, and states do so by constructing a basic infrastructure for the delivery of education. But a lot goes into this. There's a lot of variables, and it's complicated. It includes, what grade levels over the history that's been expanded. We're seeing expansion now to include pre-K and now towards community college. It also includes what kind of resources are going to go into funding this basic infrastructure and the type of resources. Some are more vulnerable than others, and we're going to get into this. So like the income tax can be more vulnerable than a property tax, etc. But it's really this foundational moment for policy at the state level, where legislatures play this very key critical role as if you're Frank Lloyd Wright's on the education scene. And that's why we have this Frank Lloyd Wright blueprint here. And it's not well appreciated among many of the people I go out and speak with. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen from the Great Recession and what impacts and stories that might have for what's happening right now. Then we're going to go into what's happening right now, what's going on, what are the pressure points, who's suffering, and then talk a little bit about what we can do and what we can expect. It's a certainty that we're going to repeat the same choices that we made during the Great Recession. And for any David Lynch fans, Twin Peaks fans out there, we can disrupt the narrative. We can create different Coopers. This is in your power. You are the individuals that help shape this basic infrastructure that provides public education. And as you well know, it's probably the biggest chunk of your budget that you contend with from year to year, from biennium to biennium. And please, at any time, throughout this presentation and hereafter, please reach out to me. I would love to hear from you, hear what you're going through, or if you want to be connected to researchers, I consider that a critical role that I play in this process. So a little bit about this framework and the principles that have undergirded education finance systems for many years now. NCSL published this publication, The Principles of a Sound State School Finance System, the year I graduated from high school in 1996. And it was a large task force of legislators and legislative staff, bipartisan, of course. And these were the principles in 1996 that they decided were undergirding a sound school finance system: equity, efficiency, adequacy, accountability, and stability. So one of the things that Erica mentioned is that we are working with a group of legislators and legislative staff that we refer to as the Education Finance Fellows. And this group of fellows, there are about 30 of them from 15 states. Some of you may be on the call right now, and if you are, I'd love for you to jump in. We've been tasked to rewrite this publication. And about a year ago, we looked at these principles and rethought them and went through kind of what they might look like and mean today. And really, they're kind of the same in essence. Stability in revenue. And this has been probably one of the biggest changes since the 90s. And that is because in the 90s, states were still largely dependent on local property tax revenue to fund K-12 education. And it's a stable source. But it's also a very, it can create some great inequities from district to district, depending on their per pupil revenue wealth. And this happened, and it was litigated. And a lot of the plaintiffs won in this litigation, and it required the states to play a larger role in funding K-12 education. And they did so by increasing the reliance on income, personal and corporate income, and sales tax revenue from the general fund to mitigate the inequities that evolved out of the property tax system. But as we're learning that there's probably a balance to be had here, and some Tom Downs at Tufts University, an education economist, refers to it as the three-legged stool of income, sales, and property tax revenue. And that's where we can find some stability. And I'm going to have some charts here in a second to show just how volatile some of these different resources are. And then there's the question of just sufficient resources. This is what was referred to, or we refer to as adequacy. But we think sufficient is a better word in this context, that every student has sufficient resources to get the education he or she needs to be a productive citizen in our democratic society, essentially. And then equity, we're trading out for the term fairness. And this cuts many ways. It's fairness for students. We all arrive at the school system with different needs and different experiences and backgrounds, but also fairness for the taxpayers who fund the system, and for all the other stakeholders in the education system, for teachers, administrators, and then it's transparency. And this kind of goes along with accountability to make sure that our funding is going those activities that really improve student learning and provide a robust education experience. But also for researchers. Researchers are very helpful for informing us for state policy on what's working, what's not working. And then finally, flexibility in the resources, so that California was this great case from history. 5 years ago, they had over 100 categorical programs that had to be spent on certain things. The classic case was a greenhouse. So if you had money for a greenhouse, you couldn't spend it for anything else but a greenhouse. And so if you didn't have a greenhouse or you had one, then that's money wasted. So kind of thinking about the way we attach certain requirements around the spending of money and rethinking that, especially during the pandemic. So that's the framework. And so out of all of this, we can kind of go back to that framework and see where things fall. So what happened during the Great Recession, I think is important to talk about, to consider what we can do now and where we're going. And this is, I'm drawing now from research from the Education Finance and Policy Journal that's sponsored by the the Association for Education Finance and Policy. And by the way, they have their annual conference coming up, and they have stipends for legislators and policymakers to attend, and it's virtual. So I would encourage anyone who really wants to get wonky and get into the academics of this to participate. But the research has showed that the Great Recession was an unprecedented impact aside from the Great Depression, and that districts that relied most on the state for revenue suffered the most. There was also a kind of unintended consequence of the federal ERA funds, the state fiscal stabilization funds that were part of the ERA law, that lasted for 3 fiscal years. And once that final fiscal year was up, when states and districts had to expend those funds, there was what we referred to back then as the funding cliff. And some of you may remember this. And what the research has shown is that those who were impacted most by the funding cliff were districts that had a smaller per pupil tax revenue base. And we're gonna get into this a little bit more. This is a screenshot of a data visualization that you can access at any time, where you can dig through the different revenues. So I put all this together through Census Bureau data. This is just one of the reports on this that you can access through this URL at the bottom. Another one shows state-specific data, so you can go and look at your state revenue-specific data and the changes since the peak revenue at the third quarter of 2008. But what we see, the story that this is telling, is that individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, general sales declined during the Great Recession, but property taxes increased. And so this is part of what the research is saying, and what this picture here is telling us, is that the districts that had the capacity, the fiscal capacity to raise revenue, to make up for losses in state revenue, they did. And when they did, it exacerbated these inequities from district to district that had already existed and had been litigated and whatnot. And it turns out that these same districts are also where a lot of the most vulnerable students live, these property poor districts. And what the research has shown, again, let me pause there. This is just showing for schools specifically, the same story that we're seeing. The state revenues went down, adjusted for inflation, just below 10% in 2013 when the fiscal cliff happened. Yet local property tax revenues never dipped below the high in 2008. But what happened is that there was an impact on student achievement, that the students who were the most vulnerable to declines in revenue indeed felt that. And we have good evidence to suggest that yes, student learning decreased. This is just another way to look at the same situation. On the left side, you'll see this is information that I put together, that balance between state and local revenue that goes into the K-12 finance system. I took federal revenue out. since that's not really a policy lever for states. But it has been pretty consistent over the last 10 plus years. Marguerite Rose at the Economics Lab in Georgetown put this other graph together showing the changes in reliance on local versus state. And the point is that as states rely more on state revenue, we have to be cognizant that there's more vulnerability and volatility in our revenues during economic fluctuations and downturns. So what's happening now as we see state revenues going down and also local pressures on schools who have to respond to the COVID crisis that increase, putting upward pressure on their expenditures. This is a picture of my son from yesterday. We are remote learning. He's a 7-year-old in 2nd grade, along with his twin brother, and he's not happy about remote learning. And I just took this picture about 24 hours ago, and you can see in his eyes that he's not very happy that he's having to do this at home. And he loves his friends, and you know, this is probably a scene that many of us are familiar with, and lament that this is the case. But you know, moving forward, this is the rest of the presentation is kind of about how to mitigate this kind of the pain and discomfort that a lot of our children are experiencing. Erica, this is my apologies to you. I took data, and Emily too, probably data that you've provided on our website and created my own map for my own tracking, for my own information to try to track what's happening with states and state revenue. But what I did, and you should pine in if I'm totally off base here, but for fiscal year 2021, looks like on average, if you look at all the projected revenue declines across the states, we're about a 10.9, 11, somewhere between 10 and 11% for states. And looking back at the Great Recession, there was something in the revenue that was a little bit similar, and other research for K-12 has suggested that about 10% in state revenue decline means about 6% in state funding for schools, just kind of on average. It's kind of a rule of thumb. I point to some research by Bruce Baker to come up with that number, and some of the research that I did through those prior data visualizations. So it's kind of really difficult to track what's happening right now in real time. Economics Lab, again, is trying to do this and surveying news stories, anything they can to get an idea of what's happening in school districts to address declines in revenue for them. So this is updated as of a few days ago from Economics Lab, and out of 385 districts, there's about 13 to 14,000 school districts in the country, by the way. So this is a very small subset, very small sample. But what they're finding is that about half of those are definitely trimming their budgets, and a good chunk of those are doing so through layoffs. And this is an important thing to consider for state policymakers, because the layoffs can look differently. Who's being laid off? Oftentimes we do we call the LIFO, the last in, first out way of considering layoffs. But is that really the most effective way? Is it really serving students best? Things to consider. Or salary reductions are also happening. So I think this is a good website if you're interested to see what your districts are doing to accommodate some of the reductions in state aid. And the other thing that's been talked a lot about because of remote learning is whether there's learning loss happening. And this is research that just came out a couple days ago from NWEA. NWEA is a well-regarded assessment provider in education. Many of you may have heard of the MAPS test. Maybe if you have kids in school, they take the MAPS test, which is a math assessment, formative assessment. And also thank you to NWA. They are a foundation sponsor of NCSL. But they provide, I think there's more students in the country that take the MAPS formative assessment in math than any other formative math assessment. And out of, they've been able to come up with some information on what the results, how students are learning. And this is looking at particularly at math scores. And what we see is that students are falling behind in math. They're not, they're still learning, but they're falling behind. And reading turns out to be a little bit better. They're doing better in reading, but math is where the problem is. But one of the things they said is that in their data, they were missing a lot of students that they had tracked from previous years. And these students, to quote Ms. Tarasawa at NWA, who helped oversee the NAPS assessment, that these children are more likely to be Black and brown, more likely to be from high poverty schools, and more likely to have lower performance in the first place. And that was a quote to NPR on Tuesday. So learning loss is happening, and it's disproportionate, just like we saw in the Great Recession. I think this is good evidence to suggest that there should be some other options we can consider to mitigate the impacts on the most vulnerable students. Again, going back to, I appreciate Marguerite for her analysis here, who's really done the most at this kind of this local level to get a sense for what's happening in our actual schools. But what we're seeing is that with reduced teacher turnover, our salary costs drive up, and experienced teachers aren't replaced by novices, as you said. So it puts upward pressure on the expenses for education. The other expenses, of course, are the cost of reopening schools, and there's been a great deal of analysis trying to figure that out. I've been working with Mike Griffith at the Learning Policy Institute to put a number on that, and we projected what the cost would be per school to improve the ventilation systems. And we're looking at some astronomical figures with that. That's forthcoming. But the other thing I kind of want to highlight here is that I put this together in April, this kind of cascading notion, and it appears to be playing out, where we are feeling this immediate impact in sales tax, but fortunately it was mitigated by remote sales tax. But as personal income and corporate income declines, and individuals go on the Medicaid enrollment, that the pressures on state budgets are very real, and cuts are very real. And the options that states have are limited, but we're going to talk about this in just one second. But here's one of my favorite quotes that's about revenue forecasting. If you have to forecast often. So disrupting the narrative. Can we do anything to mitigate the damages or the harm to our most vulnerable students? This is a graph that I have stolen from West Ed, and particularly Sean Tanner, who's a wonderful education economist at West Ed, very thoughtful. And I'm not going to really explain this very well, but those who are familiar with economics, as I assume most of you are, it's really showing the law of diminishing returns. On the x-axis, it's level of resources that a student comes with when they show up, he or she shows up to school. It can be family background, education levels of the parents, income, additional adults in the house that can help with education at home, anything that comes into the basket of goods that helps students thrive and learn. And then on the y-axis is our kind of limited way of measuring student learning and growth, test scores. And if you are a student who is farther down on the x-axis with levels of resources to improve student learning, the loss from just even 10% of those resources is much greater in the academic output of that student versus a student who is farther up on the x-axis. 10% losses in revenue for them is less impactful for learning. the loss of learning that can occur from 10% of reduction of whatever that basket of goods are that go into the resources to provide education. So West Ed and we've NCSL and West Ed, we've partnered to come up with a series of policy briefs that kind of explore this more. So this graph is actually from one of those policy briefs. So some considerations is applying a sliding scale to account for some of these student needs. How sensitive can state funding systems be to account for different needs, and can they kind of reduce the harm to our most vulnerable populations? And again, considering accounting for differences in the district's ability to raise revenue. And a good example that I have for this is from Georgia, who had to make some pretty severe cuts to education for fiscal year 2021. But they made those cuts, but they also increased by 750 million somewhere additional revenue for school districts whose per pupil revenue was below the statewide average. So it kind of being cognizant of the fact that yes, districts come to the table with different ability to raise revenue locally. But also considering the length of how long this recession will be, and the ability to consider the whole revenue pie, including state revenue, sales, income, and kind of the other piece, which is local revenue, which was, as we know, is more stable. But then the other thing that may be more immediate right now too is lifting restrictions on these categorical programs, which I mentioned earlier. And this is where giving school districts the latitude to direct resources where they need them now, and not spending them on the greenhouse when no students are in school, they're remote learning. So these kinds of considerations of giving flexibility are things that each state can do. You can go through your categorical programs, look at your different expenditures and see if there's any area where there can be some latitude given to districts to expend those revenues differently than may be required under current statute. The last, I guess one of the last things I have here is one of the last things, the penultimate thing, I guess, maybe something I stole from my wife. She's an infectious diseases public health doctor at Denver Health, and she and a friend of ours who's a professor of urban planning at UC Denver published this article about where you live may increase your risk for contracting COVID-19. And the thing I really found fascinating about this is the granularity with which they looked at Denver, neighborhood to neighborhood. And my wife has been using this map to direct free testing for COVID among her staff. So they'll look at this and see where the risk is highest in the city. And then that's where they plan to have a free testing event on a Saturday or a Wednesday or something like that. And this kind of granularity happens at district levels, but I think it's in Denver, actually public schools is a pretty good example of this. But in thinking more granularly about identifying the most vulnerable students and making sure we somehow can get the resources where they are right now for what they need to make sure that they learn. One of the stories of all this too is research from Eric Kanushek at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, who recently measured the economic loss from learning loss. And I'll refer to that paper in the resources that I'll provide in the PowerPoint. So lastly, kind of the big hurdle we're facing right now in our funding systems, in our funding formulas, is addressing this shift in students from brick and mortar schools to online learning, or from one district to another that may have a highly regarded virtual learning or online school. We'll see some parents moving their students to those virtual programs. So one report in the New York Times suggested that this is somewhere between 2 to 4% in these shifts in enrollment, which is a huge actually impact for school funding systems. We're still really in the dark as to where this is happening. I imagine your SEAs has a good handle on this, and I hope they do, and I hope they're tracking this. We're trying to figure out among some of my colleagues in the education finance world of what the real implications are, and maybe what is the best approach to this. And I don't think any consensus yet on what the best approach may be to dealing with these fluctuations in enrollment from school to school, district to district. But for those who come from states with different funding mechanisms, I just want to give an overview of what they look like from state to state. There's different ways that states count pupils for purposes of the funding formula. There's the single count day, and Colorado is a good example of this, where October 1st, or I can't remember the exact date, that's the count that the state uses for funding for the current year. Some states use multiple count days throughout the year, every quarter, for example. Others use an average daily attendance versus average daily membership. So this is enrollment versus attendance. So for example, states or districts that are more urban, that have experienced more truancy, like the membership metric better than the average daily attendance measure. Single count period, multiple count periods. The other thing about this is that the counts can apply for the current school year or the next school year, or a hybrid between prior year and the current year. And this is something to think about as you're looking at the changes in enrollment in your state. Is there a way that you can kind of follow the students where they are to make sure that funding for what student who was enrolled in a brick and mortar school last year gets the sufficient resources they need if they're in a virtual school setting right now or something like that. So again, it's kind of unsettled. We're not entirely clear on the best way forward on what's the best practice in this environment. There's many different options. I'm closely getting done with tracking the legislation on this. I've been tracking the pupil count changes, and I've got halfway to go. And so stay tuned. At the end of the year, I'll have a better picture of what you've been doing in all your states in regard to changes to enrollment counts. I've been talking a lot. I don't know if there's been anyone that's wanted to interject or opine, but that is kind of the roundup of everything I wanted to share. But again, I'll share the slides and at the end I have a long list of a lot of resources, academic news, etc., that hopefully you can use to inform your work on this topic. And again, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to entertain comments, critiques, questions.
Thanks, Dan. Any questions for Dan? Please feel free to drop them in the chat box or unmute yourself, and feel free to ask a question or share some of your experiences in your states. Well, I'll start, Dan. I have kind of a question for you. You mentioned sort of the fiscal cliff that happened after ERA funds expired for students, and with no more federal stimulus available, is there some concern around that for school districts happening right now?
There are school districts that are planning on another round of stimulus coming, and I think there's been some states that may have similarly budgeted with the assumption that maybe there's some more federal funds coming. Yeah, as everyone well knows, states don't borrow money the way the federal government does, and with just relying on state and local revenue, I think a lot of districts are going to be very vulnerable if that's all there is for them to access in the coming school year. Not in the current school year, and the next school year, and the next school year after that. The way a lot of us are thinking about this is not a one-off disruption in school revenue. It's going to be a multi-year issue to catch up with the declines and drops in revenue and all the associated expenditures that have come along with the pandemic.
Great, thanks. We have another question here, but before I ask it, do you mind if I stop sharing your screen so we can
Please.
see you?
Yes.
Actually, yeah, great, thanks. All right, the first question is an enrollment question. Are other states seeing large decreases in enrollment of students? And if so, wouldn't that help save state funds?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So yeah, we don't have a good estimate. Again, it's about somewhere between 2 to 4%. But I think there's a potential saving because these pupils aren't counted in the funding formula in the pupil counts. But these pupils are they're going somewhere, and the declines in enrollment may actually be more of from exodus out of one district to another that's not correctly being accounted for. So it's not clear that it is in aggregate at the state level. They're just looking at drops in revenue or attendance from district to district. But I think the qualm that some people have with this is that these students are leaving the system to private schools for this current school year, but then they'll go back into the school system in the next school year. So it may be a savings, perhaps, depending on how you count enrollment, whether it's for this year or if you do a blended between this school year or the next, or if it's for the next school year. So it's something to be cognizant of, but also to be cognizant that there may be a sudden intake of pupils in the school system in school years to come. So it's maybe kind of just fungible, sources, if you can look at it that way, that you may save this year, but the next year you will have greater upward pressure on your expenditures in terms of the pupil counts.
Great. Thank you, Dan. The next question, can you talk more about what Georgia did? How did they distribute those extra $750 million to schools with poor local funding? And how did they choose which schools got it?
So the statute, the bill language, I guess, said that it's any district that is under the statewide average in per pupil local revenue. So however Georgia defines that, that's how they identify the districts. How they distributed it, I can't remember from the bill language, but I'm guessing it's probably on a per pupil basis. So they would divide the 750 million across these districts that are below the statewide average. I think average was the language that the word they used in the bill, and then distribute it based upon the pupil counts. Again, the pupil counts, which I think this is a really important issue that we just still don't have a good handle on. If anybody has any experiences or how they dealt with it from their state, I would really welcome hearing your experiences on it.
Does anyone want to chime in on that subject? Okay, another question here. Are any states considering funding options to hold divisions harmless for enrollment loss this year? Strategies on how to do a hold harmless if the full amount is not available. Here in Virginia, fall enrollment decreased 3% compared to last fall. 30% of the loss is attributed to kindergarten students. This means the ADM count in the spring will be lower. And I don't know if you want to go ahead and read that in the chat box, Dan, if I did that question.
Oh, no, I'm looking at it right now. Yeah. So some of the experiences that we've seen from states is that the way that a lot of the hold harmless provisions work in education finance is that they'll take the average of 5 years of the pupil count or 3 years, and then fund at that level. And there's different opinions about hold harmless. Some opinions say that you're just delaying inevitable difficult decisions at the local level. if you hold them harmless. But then there's the other side, which is, but it's also important for planning purposes. If you're a budget official in a district, you like to have some fairly consistent, stable revenue to plan for the future. But they hold harmless. One thing to keep in mind is that they're expensive. And Colorado, and I keep pointing out to Colorado, it's where we're at, but they have what they call phantom students that the state spends millions of dollars on what we call phantom students. And these are the students who, if enrollment drops from one year to the next, so if you have a small district and you had 75 students last year and this year you have 50, there's like, whatever the average is between 75 and 50, that's the number of phantom students the state's going to fund. And this adds up, so it's expensive. So it's a policy discussion, and I don't think there's a right answer, because it's whether you want to force these difficult decisions now, and how much you have to spend on the cost of hold harmless provisions, and how much weight you want to give to your local division school districts for planning and budget purposes.
Great, thank you, Dan. Any other questions for Dan? Dan, feel free to drop it in the chat box or unmute. All right, Dan, if there are no other questions, do you have any, parting thoughts or advice for our analysts today, or anything else you'd like to add?
I hope I didn't bore everyone.
Never, Dan.
It's, there's a few of us that just really love ed finance, and we can talk all day about it. So if you ever want to call me up and chat, I always love a good ed finance chat. But thank you for listening to me and for tuning in, and please reach out. I can connect you with good researchers. Again, I feel like that's my role, is to work with and know the researchers in the field so that you have access to them and you can ask them some of these more technical questions that require a lot of training and background and oftentimes a PhD to answer. So we're here to connect you to that expertise.
Great, thank you, Dan. So I think with that brings us to the end of our call today. As Dan mentioned, if you have any questions following this event, please feel free to contact Dan directly or myself or Emily. As a reminder, this session was recorded and the slides and recording will be available on our website. And if you have time, please tune into our next program in the NALFO Fall Series, which will take place on Monday and is on how legislatures are getting back to work. Thank you guys so much for your time today, and thank you, Dan, for all your expert information.
Take care, everyone.